My Years with Ludwig Von Mises, Margaret Von Mises, New Rochelle, New York, Arlington House, 1976. Reviewed by Gary North in the Journal of Christian Reconstruction, Winter 1976 through 77, Volume 3, Number 2. This biography of Mises is a rewarding one. His widow writes well, has a remarkable memory, and understands the ways of scholars. She understands the importance of Mises' work. She also informs the reader about facets of Mises' personality that were known only to a handful of people, and sometimes known only to her. Mises was her senior by about 15 years. He was born in 1881 and died in 1973. He published his first book in 1902 at age 21 before he received his doctorate, which he earned in 1906. In 1912 he published The Theory of Money and Credit, which became a path-breaking work. In 1920 he published his classic essay on the impossibility of rational economic calculation in a socialist economy. In 1922 he expanded it into the book Socialism, which was to change the thinking of dozens of key younger scholars in Europe. After World War I, he served as an advisory and high official in the Austrian Chamber of Commerce, which was part of the government. His private seminar, a tradition among the great scholars of Austrian Germany, draws students like F.A. Hayek, Wilhelm Röpke, Ludwig Erhardt's teacher, Lionel, now Lord, Robbins, and others. Mrs. Mises did not meet him until 1925, when his career was well established. Mrs. Mises was already a widow with 2 young children, a former actress. She had given up the stage at the request of her late husband, and she supported her family by translating English-language plays into German. She says that Mises loved her from the beginning, but that he feared the responsibilities of a family. He was afraid that his work would suffer. He did not marry her until after her children were grown in 1938. While she fails to mention it, his literary output between 1922 and 1940 was not that exceptional. It was after he married her that he reached the next plateau in his career. She does say that his most productive period was 1944 through 69, after he had come to the United States in 1989. Page 89, In terms of original thinking on his part, this is an overstatement, but in terms of consolidating and popularizing his work, it is certainly true. Several fascinating facts come to light in this biography. She says that he refused to take a high-paying position in 1929 with the Austrian Credit Anstalt, the most prestigious banking firm in Austria. He told her a great economic crash was coming, and that he did not want his name associated with the firm. It failed in 1931, toppling what remained of the whole European economy. He later chided Joseph Schumpeter, his former classmate and a more famous in America economist, for having been Minister of Finance of Austria during the Great Inflation of 1923, and with having been president of the Biedermann Bank when it failed in the 1930s. Mises left Austria in 1934 to take a teaching position in the Graduate Institute of Geneva. He knew what was in store for Austria from the Nazis. In 1938, Nazi centered his mother's home in Austria, confiscated his library and his manuscripts. He never saw them again. For some reason, Mrs. Mises fails to mention that Mises was a Jew, a marked man in a Nazi-occupied country. She explains their hostility in terms of their opposition to his free market writings, which is only part of the story. She escaped from Austria in 1938, and they were married soon after. She recalls vividly their 6 years in Geneva. He taught only 2 hours a week, yet was well paid. He associated with world-famous scholars like Röpke, Hans Kelsen, Gottfried Haballer, William Rappert, and Louis Baden, author of neglected work on the socialist empire of the Incas, which Mises later helped to get published in this country. He adapted to marriage quite readily, she says. Even his temper disappeared after a few years. He was a true scholar, thinking constantly. She says that it took him an hour and a half to bathe, shave, and dress. He said that he had his best thoughts as he shaved. These habits did not change when he came to America. He hated any disturbance while he worked, and I would say that he started working in the bathroom. More than once he was so deeply in his thoughts that he forgot to turn the faucet off, and only when his feet were deep in water did he realize what was happening around him. They fled Europe in the summer of 1940, crossing the Swiss border into France, and from France into Spain. They waited a month in Lisbon for a ship to the United States. They wanted to get an earlier ship out, but the city was filled with refugees, and others also wanted on board. She offers this insight into his personality. Quote, and I spent half a day on the telephone calling the export line's office. Lou made no further move. He could neither relax nor enjoy what he was doing. He was uprooted. For the first time I noted what I later so often had the opportunity to see. He could fight for a cause, but never for himself. And when he could not work, he was listless. He once told me, quote, a writer who has something to tell needs a pencil and a sheet of paper. That's all, unquote. Looking back, I think Lou forgot something more important. A writer also needs peace of mind. In America, the first few years were difficult. He had been offered a job at the University of California, Berkeley, but he decided that New York City was the intellectual center of the country. They had to move 5 times in the city during the first year, and he grew tired of having to move his library. He received a $2,500 grant from the National Bureau of Economic Research in 1941, and this was renewed until 1945. He wrote 9 articles for the New York Times for $10 each. From 1943 to 1954, he worked closely with the National Association of Manufacturers. Though Mrs. Mises does not record that he received any pay for this, he lectured around the country. Lawrence Ferté, a columnist, and Henry Hazlitt saw to it that Mises was never penniless. Still, Mises struggled. He got a job with New York University in 1945 as a visiting professor, teaching a 2-hour seminar weekly and receiving $1,000 per semester. He taught at NYU until 1969. His students include Hans Stenholtz, Israel Kirzner, and a number of scholars who went on in other academic fields. She says that he became an American year by year, and that he was happy to receive his citizenship in 1946. He thought of himself as an American from that time on. He had great hopes for America, though she mentioned it only indirectly. His pessimism later increased over the years concerning America's future. Mises believed in the power of ideas. She includes a fragment from a speech he gave to the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce in 1943. The arena in which the fate of the West will be decided is neither a conference room of the diplomats nor the offices of the bureaucrats, not the Capitol in Washington, not the election campaigns. The only thing which really matters is the outcome of the intellectual combat between the supporters of socialism and those of capitalism. The masses, those millions of voters who are supreme in democracy, have to learn that they are deluded by spurious doctrines and that only market society and free enterprise can bring them what they want, prosperity. But in order to persuade the crowd, you have first to convince the elite, intellectuals, and the businessmen themselves. No wonder Mises was a pessimist from 1912 until he died. The battle for ideas went to the socialists from the turn of the century until the present. After 1950, the socialists won the United States. The Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers were the first ones to applaud President Nixon in August 1971 when he declared a price freeze. New York University was at war with Mises almost from the beginning, never giving encouragement to students to take his courses, although his prestige and lots of money from the Volcker Fund kept him on the faculty. One student in the NYU economics department was told by his advisor that he could take Mises' seminar on his own, but that he would not be given credit for it on his official program. Mises' theory is a religion, not economics, said the advisor. The elite, as Mises knew so well, believed in socialism in our century. Since he had faith only in ideas held by the elite, willful, perverse, and deeply religious rejection of capitalism by the elite on non-rational grounds offered Mises no help. The review, quote-unquote, of his book, Planned Chaos, that appeared in the American Economic Review in 1946, stands as the most savage, unthinking, irrational review that ever appeared in that establishment journal. The elite who knew of Mises occasionally attacked him, but most preferred to ignore him, to pretend he was not alive. Hayek describes the effect of Mises' socialism had on his generation. In the 1920s, Röpke, Robbins, Olin, and the others. It was not easy. Professor Mises' teaching seemed directed against all we had been brought up to believe. It was a time when all the fashionable intellectual arguments seemed to point to socialism, when nearly all good men, quote-unquote, among the intellectuals were socialists. Though the immediate influence of the book may not have been as great as one might have wished, it is in some ways surprising that it had as great an influence as it did. Because for the young idealist at the time, it meant the dashing of all his hopes, and so it was clear that the world was bent on the cause whose destructive nature the work pointed out. If it left us with little but black despair, and to those of us who knew Professor Mises personally, it became, of course, soon clear that his own view about the future of Europe and the world was one of the deep pessimists. How justified a pessimism we were soon to learn. 1956 speech by Hayek reprinted as Appendix 2. Quote appears on page 190. Anyone who doubts that Mises was shabbily treated by the academic establishment, especially by the Keynesians, who took over the nation's institutions of higher propaganda after 1950 once the older generation had retired or died off, can learn of the way the enemy works in Chapter A of the book, The Story of Human Action. We are dealing with vicious, unprincipled, evil men, not men who simply have bad ideas, but snakes. Mises' great error, an error shared, unfortunately, by Hayek and others who are defenders of the free market, is that he did not acknowledge the total depravity of man and the specific depravity of the socialist Keynesian elite. They are religious fanatics. The battle is only secondarily a battle of rational arguments. The chief battle is emotional and religious. But rationalists like Mises and Hayek are ill-equipped to fight a religious war. They do not acknowledge the truth of that unnamed faculty advisory's claim. Mises' theory is religious doctrine. So is that of the unnamed advisor. The rationalists cannot grasp this fact. As R.M. Hartwell has said, the battle is ideological, not factual. See Bruce Bartlett's essay above, page 162 through 163. Yale University Press, under the editorship of Eugene Davidson, published Mises' book from 1944 until the mid-1960s. Yale took Human Action, the 900-page tome, and published it in 1944. It made money for them, going through 6 printies. In 1959, Davidson resigned. His successors wanted to abandon Mises. Unfortunately, Human Action was one of the few profitable books the subsidized Vanity Press had on its list. They wanted the royalties. The result of their plans was the second edition of Human Action, published in 1969, the most frightful printing job that any university press has perpetrated on an unsuspecting public that I have ever seen. Typographical errors abound, typefaces of different intensity appear, one page is missing, one page is repeated, a typesetter's nightmare. They refused to allow Mises to see the gallery proofs. They did not send him a complimentary author's copy. They hiked the price of the book from $10 to $15. Mrs. Mises reprints of Hazlitt's enraged review of this atrocity, a review which I clipped and have in my files. National Review, May 5th, 1964. Hazlitt was correct. It was a calculated disaster. Mises was deeply hurt. Mrs. Mises reports that it was one of the worst experiences of his life. He was a gentleman of the old dead European culture. Now he was getting a taste of the treatment handed out by the jackals of anti-culture, the prestige elite who trained the minds of the sons and daughters of the suicidal middle classes and upper classes who subsidized the Yales and Harvards of our disintegrating culture. When Henry Regnery offered to bring out the third edition of Human Action in 1966, Yale University Press was only too happy to oblige, for a price, of course. Now they could abandon this man's books, yet still rake off the royalties, reducing the annual deficit of this academic vanity press. They dropped all of his other books, too. As Mrs. Mises writes, but one thing is sure, the ideological differences that may have existed between Ludwig von Mises and the Yale University Press did not hinder the press from taking its cut. All through the years, the press insisted was contract and percentage. Every year when the Yale statement arrived, Lou read it and then gave it to me without a word. But the shrug of his shoulders and the slight gesture of contempt revealed his feeling more clearly than the words ever could. The academic world of the Keynesian era buried Mises. The Keynesian generation in America was unfamiliar with his work. Few American scholars can read foreign languages. The language exams in graduate school are a meaningless, ridiculous ritual that is still practiced today only for the sake of tradition as a means of screening out candidates for degrees who refuse to put up with this charade. This has always been true of American graduate schools. They want to pretend that they produce scholars as broadly trained as those who have attended European universities. In cultural matters, this is a joke. American PhDs are narrow specialist technicians, so the men who might have used Mises' work to defend themselves from the Keynesians prior to 1945 did not know of his writings. And those who came after Yale's 1944 decision to publish Mises did not read old-fashioned economists unless they happened to be early socialists or incomprehensible mathematical economists. Only non-professional economists, journalists, businessmen, and assorted free market defenders bothered to read Mises' works until quite recently. There is not a single tenured professor in any economics department in America with the exception of 2 men at New York University, one of whom is questionable, who is a serious follower of Mises, and who is allowed to teach graduate students. No highly respected university has a Mises follower on his tenured staff. There are approximately a dozen PhDs in economics in the U.S. who are known to be followers of Mises. He was effectively buried. He knew it too, as his wife records. Once I told Lou, "Darling, even you have to agree you are famous." He smiled and answered, "You can recognize the importance of an author only by the frequency of references to his work by other scholars written at the end of a page under the line. The sign of academic success is your name, not up in lights, but down in footnotes." Mises' name never gets in English language footnotes, not approved general economics textbooks, some in specialized histories of economic thoughts, such as Haney, left-wing colleague at NYU, never in the economics journals. The one reference to him that is ever found is for his essay on economic calculation under socialism, and is always followed by the outright lie that the Polish communist economist Oscar Lange refuted Mises' criticism of socialist planning. Mises' name has been successfully flushed down the academic memory hole, Orwell's brilliant term for historical oblivion, enforced historical oblivion. F.A. Hayek was given the Nobel Prize in Economics less than a year after Mises' death. Officially, the award went to him because of his early work before The Road to Serfdom, 1944. Skeptics have argued that Hayek's award was given as a counter to the co-winner in 1974, the socialist Gunnar Myrdal. Other skeptics have said that the committee deliberately waited until Mises was dead. Hayek's work in the 1930s was basically a series of amplifications of ideas offered first in Mises' theory of money and credit and socialism. This criticism of the Nobel Committee overlooks the obvious. Nobody in authority remembered Mises in 1974. His books have not been assigned to a class of budding economists since the 1930s. And probably not then, except in German-speaking countries. It was Hayek who published Mises' ideas, and only a tiny handful of specialists know where Hayek got his ideas. Since nobody has read Mises in the economic scale if he is under 70, the award should have gone to Mises in 1969. But who remembered Mises' late 1949? Only amateurs. Compared to Mises and his seminar students in the 1920s, today's economists are false giants surrounded by real pygmies. That the Austrian School of Economics, personified by Mises, is dead. Its few remaining adherents are either middle-aged men buried in obscure colleges or philosophical anarchists. The younger PhDs in economics claim to be followers of Mises are all anarchists, narrow, over-specialized single language, and unaware of the sources of Mises' vast philosophical and cultural knowledge. They are PhDs in economics, unlike Mises, Hayek, and Röpke, who were trained in law, took their degrees in law, and received the education in liberal arts institutions that did not recognize economics as a separate discipline. The men who still follow Mises, and who have some tenuous relationship with the academic world, are either anarchists or Christians, and Mises did not agree with either group. The Austrian school as a university movement is dead. We are waiting around for rigor mortis to set in. Only Israel Kirzner at NYU still holds up the flag of the traditional Austrian school. The intellectual world which made it possible for Mises' ideas to circulate was destroyed, first by Hitler, then by Keynes, and now at best by Milton Friedman and his followers. This biography on the shelf for everyone who reads Mises' work. Few economists will buy it, obviously, but a lot of serious amateurs will buy it. The amateurs still read Mises, and for this reason, the long-term fate of Mises' ideas have been taken out of the hands of the university bureaucrats. This is one reason why, in 2 centuries, people may still be reading Mises when Keynes and his epigons will be forgotten, or rewarded as a grim joke. To be dependent for the survival of your work on the tenured incompetents who staff the universities today is to face oblivion. Mises' ideas will be modified drastically, but the contributions will survive. The amateurs, not the professionals, will keep reading Mises. Truth survives. Tenured orthodoxy does not.